Imagine a world in ruins, not from a foreign invasion, but from a cancer of its own making. Imagine a civilization that gave the world philosophy, democracy, and art, now exhausted by a generation of endless petty warfare. The glorious city of Athens, its golden age a fading memory, is humbled and resentful. The mighty warrior state of Sparta, victorious but bled dry, is a paranoid shadow of its former self. This is the state of Greece in the middle of the 4th century BC. It is a fractured, broken world of bickering city-states, each too proud to unite, too weak to dominate. They are blind to the storm gathering on their northern border, a storm that will consume them all. I'm curious to know where you are watching from in the world today. Let us know in the comments below as we begin our journey. This poison of division had a name, the Peloponnesian War. For nearly 3 decades, Athens and Sparta, the two brothers who had once stood shoulder to shoulder to defy the Persian Empire, had torn each other to pieces. The war had left a scar across the soul of Greece. Athens, once the beacon of democracy and culture, had seen its empire shattered, its magnificent long walls torn down, and its spirit crushed by a brutal Spartan-backed oligarchy. Though they had heroically restored their democracy, they were a shadow of their former glory, a city filled with a bitter pride and a deep distrust of its neighbors. Their treasury was depleted, their military confidence shaken after the catastrophic Sicilian expedition, and their political landscape was a chaotic battlefield of ambitious demagogues who sought power through emotional appeals rather than wise counsel. Sparta, the nominal victor, had fared little better. Their military supremacy was unquestioned, but their society, a rigid pyramid built entirely on the backs of a terrorized slave class known as the Helots, was a demographic time bomb. Decades of constant warfare had decimated the ranks of their elite warrior citizens, the Spartiates. They were a hollowed-out superpower, their grip on Greece maintained through sheer brutality and a reputation they could no longer fully support. Into this power vacuum rose a new hegemon, the city of Thebes, whose brilliant generals, Pelopidas and Epaminondas, had even managed to defeat the Spartans in open battle at Leuctra in 371 BC, shattering the myth of Spartan invincibility forever. But their dominance was fragile, built on the genius of a few men, and the rest of Greece chafed under their rule. This was a world of broken alliances, shifting loyalties, and endless, inconclusive wars. A world ripe for a true conqueror. The storm had a name, Philip II, King of Macedon. To the sophisticated Greeks in the south, Macedon was a backwater kingdom of shepherds and timber merchants, a semi-barbaric land whose people spoke a rough dialect of Greek, drank their wine undiluted, and were ruled by a monarchy they considered primitive. But Philip was no mere barbarian. He was a visionary, a master diplomat, and a military genius of the highest order. His youth was the crucible that forged the man who would change the world. As a young prince, he had been sent as a hostage to the city of Thebes, at the very height of its power. Here, he was not a prisoner, but a student. For 3 years, he lived in the house of the general Pamenes, where he observed, listened, and learned. He witnessed firsthand the revolutionary tactics of the Theban generals Epaminondas and Pelopidas, the men who had broken Sparta. He studied their innovative use of an echelon formation, where one flank was massively reinforced to act as a decisive hammer. He saw the power of the sacred band, a full-time professional corps of elite soldiers who trained constantly. These lessons in combined arms, tactical flexibility, and military professionalism would become the foundation of his own revolution. When he returned to Macedon in 359 BC, he inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse. His brother, the king, had been killed in battle. The army was a disorganized rabble, and the nation was beset by enemies on all sides. The fierce Illyrians to the west, the Paeonians to the north, and the Thracians to the east were all poised to carve up his kingdom. Philip, in a display of the energy and decisiveness that would define his reign, acted immediately. He reformed the government, rallied the nobility, and most importantly, he began to build a new kind of army. Through sheer force of will and a revolutionary vision, he would transform his nation from a failed state into a superpower. Philip's genius was in seeing that the old way of war was dead. The Greek model of part-time, citizen soldiers fighting in a rigid phalanx was obsolete. He took the traditional hoplite formation and turned it into an instrument of annihilation. He armed his soldiers not with the short spear of a hoplite, but with the Sarissa, a terrifying 18-foot pike, wielded two-handed and made from tough cornel wood. When his men locked their shields, they did not just form a wall, they became a giant, unstoppable hedgehog of death. The first 5 ranks of his phalanx could present their pikes forward, creating an impenetrable forest of steel that no traditional army could approach without being impaled. This was the anvil upon which he would smash his enemies. But an anvil is useless without a hammer. Philip's true genius was in perfecting combined arms. He professionalized his army, turning part-time farmers into full-time, state-paid soldiers, loyal only to him. This was a radical departure from the citizen-soldier model of the South, and it forged a bond between king and army that was unbreakable. He created the Hypaspists, an elite, flexible infantry force that could guard the vulnerable flanks of his phalanx or act as shock troops, bridging the gap between his infantry and cavalry. He perfected the art of siege warfare, developing new and terrifying torsion catapults that could smash down the walls of any city that dared to defy him. And most importantly, he forged the finest heavy cavalry in the world, the Companion Cavalry. These were the sons of the Macedonian aristocracy, trained from birth to fight on horseback. Armed with the deadly 12-foot Xyston lance, they were a force of shock troops, unlike anything the Greek world had ever seen. While the phalanx held the enemy in place, the companions would charge into their flanks and rear, shattering their formation and ensuring total annihilation. This was the hammer to his phalanx's anvil, a perfectly balanced instrument of war. For 2 decades, Philip masterfully expanded his power. He subdued the fierce tribes of Illyria and Thrace, securing his northern borders and seizing control of the rich gold mines near Amphipolis, which gave him a source of wealth that no Greek city-state could match. He could afford to pay his soldiers, bribe foreign politicians, and fund his endless campaigns. Then he turned his gaze south. Through a masterful campaign of propaganda, bribery, threats, assassinations, and lightning-fast warfare, he began to methodically dismantle the fragile alliances of the Greek city-states. He used their own sacred wars over the sanctuary at Delphi as a pretext to intervene, inserting himself as the arbiter of their endless disputes. In Athens, one man saw the danger clearer than any other. The great orator Demosthenes delivered a series of fiery speeches, the Philippics, in which he tried to awaken his fellow citizens from their complacent slumber. He warned that Philip was not a partner, but a tyrant, a wolf at the door whose ambition would not stop until all of Greece was kneeling at his feet. First he takes Amphipolis, then Pydna, next Potidea, Methone last of all, he thundered at the assembly. If he takes us on one by one, he will easily master us all. But the Athenians were divided. Some, bought by Philip's gold, argued for peace. Others, basking in the memory of their golden age, could not believe that a barbarian from the north could truly threaten them. For years his warnings were largely ignored. But by 338 BC, Philip's advance was undeniable. He had seized a key strategic position in central Greece, a fortress that controlled the main road south to Athens. The final confrontation could no longer be avoided. In a moment of sheer panic and desperation, Athens finally acted. They forged a desperate alliance with their bitter rivals, the city of Thebes, the only land power left in Greece with an army formidable enough to challenge Macedon. Together they mustered one last great army, the final hope of a free Greece, and marched out to meet the northern storm on the dusty plain of Chaeronea. The army that gathered on the plain of Chaeronea in August of 338 BC was a portrait of a civilization on the brink. It was the last great army of a free and independent Greece, a final, desperate muster of the citizen-soldier ideal that had defined their world for centuries. At its heart were the two most powerful and historically significant city-states of the age, Athens and Thebes. Their alliance was a testament to the sheer terror Philip inspired, for they were bitter rivals, having fought each other for dominance for generations. But now, facing a common threat that promised total subjugation, they had put aside their hatred to stand shoulder to shoulder. The Athenians, led by generals like Charis and Lysicles, were a force of 10,000 hoplites. These were the inheritors of the legacy of Marathon, the sons of the democracy, men who believed they were fighting not just for their city, but for the very soul of Greek civilization. They were supported by a contingent of light troops and a small cavalry force. Though their military reputation had waned since the Golden Age, their patriotic fervor was undeniable. They were an army of amateurs, perhaps, but they were amateurs with everything to lose. Their allies, the Thebans, were the true military backbone of the alliance. They also numbered around 10,000, but their hoplites were considered the best in Greece. They were professional, battle-hardened, and led by experienced commanders. Their anchor, their most elite unit, was the Theban Sacred Band, a corps of 300 soldiers, made up of 150 pairs of male lovers, founded on the principle that a man would fight to the death to protect his partner. They were sworn to defend each other to the end. In the decades since their legendary victory over Sparta at Leuctra, their line had never once been broken. They were the Lion of Greece, the living embodiment of hoplite courage and the last best hope of the Allied army. Together with smaller contingents from other Allied cities, the Greeks numbered over 30,000 strong. They were confident, defiant, and ready to die for their freedom. Facing them was Philip's wolf pack, the Macedonian war machine. They were professionals, hardened veterans of a dozen campaigns, loyal not to an idea, but to their king. While similar in number, their composition was radically different. The core of Philip's force was the Sarissa Phalanx, an unbreakable wall of points, but flanking them were his superb light infantry, the hypaspists, and the most lethal shock cavalry of the age, the Companions. It was a perfectly balanced instrument of war, designed not just to fight, but to annihilate. Philip, a master of the battlefield, deployed his forces with cunning. He took personal command of his right wing, placing his finest infantry, the hypaspists, and a portion of his phalanx there, directly opposite the determined but less experienced citizen soldiers of Athens. He gave command of the left wing to his most trusted and experienced general, Parmenion. Parmenion's phalanx would face the most difficult task of the day, holding the line against the legendary Theban sacred band. It was a position that required immense discipline and courage, but on the far right of Philip's own wing, held back slightly, was a force of 2,000 elite horsemen, the very best of the Companion Cavalry. At their head, in his first major command, was Philip's 18-year-old son, a prince of breathtaking ambition and talent, the young Alexander. This would be the day the world first witnessed the speed and ferocity that would one day make him a legend. The pressure on this young prince must have been immense. What do you think was going through his mind? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. The Greeks, confident in the quality of their heavy infantry, deployed in a traditional solid line. The Athenians held the left flank, while the Thebans and their invincible sacred band held the right. Their plan was simple and proven: a direct head-on infantry clash, a brutal shoving match known as the Othismos. They believed their courage would be enough to break the Macedonian line. The battle began with a terrifying, grinding clash of infantry all along the front. The two armies crashed together with a sound like a thunderclap, a horrific noise of splintering wood, cracking shields, and the screams of the dying. On the Greek right, the Thebans and the sacred band fought with the courage of lions. As expected, they began to slowly but surely push back the Macedonian phalanx under Parmenion's command. They were living up to their reputation as the finest soldiers in Greece. On the Greek left, the Athenian hoplites, fired up by the speeches of their generals, also charged forward with great spirit, crashing into Philip's own wing. For a time, the fighting was a desperate, inconclusive struggle. But then, Philip put his masterful plan into motion. He ordered his experienced veterans on the right wing to do something that went against every warrior's instinct, to begin a slow, orderly fighting withdrawal. To the inexperienced Athenian generals, it looked like a miracle. They believed the Macedonian right wing was breaking under their assault. With triumphant shouts, they urged their men forward, breaking their own disciplined formation to chase the supposedly fleeing Macedonians up a slight incline. They thought they were on the verge of a glorious victory, of routing the king himself. But they were not chasing a broken enemy. They were walking straight into a perfectly laid trap. Philip's feigned retreat was a work of tactical genius, a maneuver that required years of training and iron discipline to pull off. He was using the Athenians' own bravery and arrogance as a weapon against them. Once the Athenians were sufficiently stretched out, disorganized, and tired from their uphill charge, Philip gave the signal. His veterans on the right wing halted their retreat, planted their feet, and with a great roar, charged back down the hill. They crashed into the now exhausted and disordered Athenian line like an avalanche. The Athenians, caught completely by surprise, saw their triumphant charge turn into a desperate struggle for survival. But the true, decisive moment was happening at the hinge of the two armies. The Athenian advance had opened a fatal gap between their own flank and the flank of the Greek center. This was the moment Philip had been waiting for, and this was the moment he unleashed his son. From his position on the far right, the 18-year-old Alexander led the Companion Cavalry in their first legendary charge. They thundered across the battlefield, not at the Athenians in front of them, but straight into the exposed, unprotected flank of the Greek center. This was the hammer blow that shattered the Greek army. The Greek soldiers in the center, engaged with the Phalanx to their front, were suddenly hit from the side by the most powerful heavy cavalry in the world. Their line disintegrated into chaos and panic. With the center broken and the Athenians now being routed by Philip's countercharge, only one force on the Greek side remained, the Thebans and their legendary sacred band on the right. They had fought with incredible bravery and had been winning their fight. But now they were alone, surrounded, their flanks exposed, and their cause utterly hopeless. Yet they refused to surrender. They refused to break. The Theban sacred band made their last stand. Surrounded by Philip's entire army, they fought to the last man, dying where they stood, protecting their partners to the very end. Their courage was so extraordinary that after the battle, Philip himself, upon seeing the 300 soldiers lying dead in their ranks, was said to have wept, declaring, "May they perish who suspect that these men either did or suffered anything dishonorable." The Battle of Chaeronea was a total, crushing victory for Philip. In a single afternoon, the military power of the free Greek city-states had been annihilated. The Athenian army was routed, and the flower of Thebes' manhood, the sacred band, lay dead on the field. The dream of Greek freedom, which had been defended for centuries, had died with them. In the aftermath, Philip's treatment of the defeated was a masterclass in political calculation. He was harsh with Thebes, the city that had so often opposed him, installing a Macedonian garrison and dissolving their league. But he was surprisingly lenient with Athens. He knew he needed the power of the Athenian navy for his planned invasion of Persia. He freed all the Athenian prisoners without ransom and offered them a generous alliance. He did not want a resentful subject. He wanted a useful partner. With all opposition now crushed, Philip convened a congress of the Greek states at Corinth. Here, he established the League of Corinth, a federation that united all of Greece, with the notable exception of Sparta, who stubbornly refused to join. He was declared the hegemon, or supreme commander, of this new league. He had achieved what no Greek city-state had ever been able to. He had united Greece, but he had done so as its master, not as its equal. The battle had another profound consequence. It had been the proven ground for his son. Alexander had not just participated, he had delivered the battle-winning blow. His legendary charge at Chaeronea had proven his courage and his tactical genius to the entire army. He had stepped out of his father's shadow and announced his arrival on the stage of history. This victory would be the foundation of the loyalty the Macedonian army would show him after Philip's death just 2 years later. With his victory at Chaeronea, Philip II of Macedon stood at the apex of his power, the undisputed master of Greece. The endless wars that had plagued the Greek world for a century were over, crushed under the weight of his Sarissa phalanx. His League of Corinth had formally united the Hellenes, and he had been declared its hegemon, the supreme commander for the great crusade he had spent his life planning, the invasion of the Persian Empire. This was to be his crowning achievement, a pan-Hellenic war of revenge that would not only enrich his kingdom beyond imagination, but would also solidify his own legacy as the greatest leader in Greek history. In 336 BC, the advance guard of his army, 10,000 men under his most trusted general, Parmenion, had already crossed into Asia Minor to prepare the way. The world held its breath, waiting for the king to follow and unleash his storm upon the east. But Philip would never see Asia. The final act of his life was not to be a grand battle, but a domestic drama of celebration and betrayal. In the ancient Macedonian capital of Aigai, Philip staged a magnificent festival to celebrate the wedding of his daughter, Cleopatra, to the king of Epirus. It was a grand affair, designed to showcase his wealth and power to the entire Greek world. Ambassadors from every city-state, including Athens, were present. The festivities were opulent, with athletic games, lavish feasts, and theatrical performances. On the second day, Philip prepared to enter the grand theater, walking in a procession alongside his son Alexander and his new brother-in-law. In a display of supreme confidence and arrogance, he dismissed his own bodyguards, ordering them to walk ahead so that he could show his Greek allies that he was protected not by force, but by their universal goodwill. It was a fatal miscalculation. As he entered the narrow, crowded passageway into the theater, a figure lunged from the crowd. It was Pausanias of Orestis, a member of his own royal bodyguard. Before anyone could react, Pausanias plunged a short Celtic dagger deep into Philip's chest. The king, the conqueror of Greece, the master of the ancient world, collapsed in a pool of his own blood, dead before he hit the ground. In the ensuing chaos, the assassin tried to flee, sprinting towards the city gates where horses were waiting for him. But he tripped on a vine, and the pursuing bodyguards, led by men who would later become Alexander's own generals, showed him no mercy, killing him on the spot with a volley of javelins. The most powerful man in the world was dead, and his killer had been silenced forever, leaving behind a shocking power vacuum and one of the greatest murder mysteries in all of history. The question of who was truly behind the assassination has haunted historians for over 2,000 years. Was it, as the official story claimed, simply an act of personal revenge? Pausanias had allegedly been the victim of a horrific sexual assault by a powerful nobleman, and Philip had failed to deliver the justice he craved. Or was this a convenient cover story for a much deeper conspiracy? Suspicion immediately fell on those who had the most to gain. Philip's estranged and fiery wife, Olympias, was a prime suspect. Philip had recently married a new, younger Macedonian noblewoman who had just given birth to a son, a potential full-blooded rival to Alexander for the throne. Olympias was known for her ruthless ambition and her hatred of Philip. It was whispered that she had not only masterminded the plot, but had even arranged the getaway horses for the assassin. And what of Alexander himself? He was the principal beneficiary of his father's death. The assassination put him on the throne at the perfect moment, just as the grand invasion was about to begin. Could he have been complicit? The historical sources are silent, but the shadow of suspicion has always lingered. Others looked further afield. Could it have been the Persian Empire, desperate to eliminate the brilliant commander who was about to invade them? Or perhaps even disgruntled Greek politicians, secretly funded by Persia, hoping to reclaim their freedom? The truth of who guided the assassin's hand was likely killed along with Pausanias, But the consequences of his act were immediate and world-altering. The king was dead. The future was in chaos. In the terrifying moments after Philip's murder, the fate of the Macedonian kingdom hung by a thread. The 20-year-old Alexander, though a proven warrior, was just one of many potential claimants to a throne that was often decided by the sword. He had rivals both within his own family and among the powerful noble houses of Macedon. A lesser man might have hesitated, might have been paralyzed by the shock and grief of the moment. But Alexander was not a lesser man. Forged in the crucible of a dangerous and violent court, he acted with a speed and ruthlessness that was nothing short of breathtaking. His first and most crucial move was to secure the loyalty of the army. He was immediately brought before the assembled soldiers by his father's most powerful generals, men like Antipater and Parmenion, who saw in him the best hope for stability. Standing before the veterans who had seen his incredible courage at Chaeronea, his armor likely still spattered with his father's blood, he was hailed as the new king. The army, the true source of all power in Macedon, was his. With this backing, he unleashed a swift and merciless purge. He began with his most immediate rivals. A cousin who had a claim to the throne was executed immediately. Two other powerful princes were put to death for their alleged role in the assassination. But the most brutal acts were reserved for his father's last wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, and her infant son, the child who represented a pure-blooded threat to his own succession. Olympias, Alexander's mother, reportedly forced the new queen to hang herself after having murdered her baby son in her arms. Alexander, whether he ordered the act or simply allowed it to happen, made no move to punish his mother. His message to the Macedonian nobility was brutally clear. There would be no rivals, the throne was his, and he would kill anyone who dared to challenge it. News of Philip's death and the subsequent bloodbath in the Macedonian court sent shockwaves through Greece. The city-states that Philip had so recently subdued saw an opportunity. They believed the Macedonian kingdom would collapse into a bloody civil war, and that the boy king, Alexander, was an inexperienced youth they could easily defy. Revolts began to simmer across the land. In Athens, Demosthenes, who had allegedly received private news of the assassination, appeared in the assembly wearing celebratory garlands, urging his fellow citizens to rise up. But it was the proud and powerful city of Thebes that made the first and most fatal move. Believing a rumor that Alexander himself had been killed while campaigning against barbarian tribes in the north, the Thebans revolted. They surrounded and killed the Macedonian garrison that Philip had installed in their citadel, the Cadmea, and declared their city free. It was a bold and defiant act, a gamble that they hoped would inspire all of Greece to join them in a great war of liberation. They had gambled on a rumor. They had gambled wrong. When news of the Theban revolt reached Alexander, he was hundreds of miles away in the north. His response was a demonstration of the terrifying speed and logistical genius that would become his trademark. He force-marched his entire army south at a pace that seemed superhuman, covering nearly 250 miles of rough terrain in just 2 weeks. He appeared before the walls of Thebes so quickly that the citizens refused to believe it was him, thinking it must be another general who shared his name. They had expected months to prepare. They were given days. Alexander initially did not want to destroy the ancient city. He offered them lenient terms, demanding only the surrender of the revolt's ringleaders. But the Thebans, trapped between their pride and their fear, refused. They taunted him from the walls, demanding that anyone who wished to free Greece should join them. Their defiance sealed their fate. Alexander, his patience exhausted, ordered a full-scale assault. The fighting was brutal. The Thebans, knowing their lives were forfeit, fought with the courage of despair. But they were no match for Alexander's veterans. The Macedonians stormed the walls, and the battle turned into a horrific, city-wide massacre. In the aftermath, Alexander convened his Greek allies from the League of Corinth and asked them to decide the fate of Thebes. In a display of cynical politics, Sparta's allies, who had long hated Thebes, voted for its total destruction. Alexander carried out their sentence with chilling efficiency. The legendary city, the home of heroes like Heracles and Oedipus, was to be razed to the ground. For weeks, the Macedonians systematically demolished every house, temple, and public building. The entire surviving population, some 30,000 men, women, and children, were rounded up and sold into slavery. The only structure Alexander ordered to be spared was the house of the great poet Pindar, a sign of the respect for high culture that had been instilled in him by his tutor Aristotle. The destruction of Thebes was a calculated act of state-sponsored terror. The message was written in fire and stone for all of Greece to see. This is the price of defying Alexander. This is the fate of those who mistake my youth for weakness. The other Greek city-states, including Athens, were horrified into submission. They quickly reaffirmed their allegiance, their dreams of freedom extinguished by the smoking ruins of Thebes. Alexander had now secured his home front not with friendship, but with fear. With Greece now pacified by terror and his throne in Macedon secured by blood, the 21-year-old Alexander was now the undisputed master of his father's kingdom. But more importantly, he was the master of his father's army. He had inherited the most lethal military force the world had ever seen. The Sarissa Phalanx, the Companion Cavalry, the elite Hypaspists, and a corps of experienced, loyal generals like Parmenion and Antipater. It was a perfect war machine, an instrument of conquest that had been forged and perfected over 2 decades of constant warfare. He had also inherited his father's ultimate ambition, the invasion of the Persian Empire. This was to be framed not as a personal war of Macedonian conquest, but as a great pan-Hellenic crusade, a sacred war of revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece over a century earlier. The destruction of the Acropolis by Xerxes was to be avenged. The Greek cities of Ionia were to be liberated. It was a powerful piece of propaganda that united the Greeks behind him, or at least gave them a noble reason to accept his rule. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander marched his army to the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia. He had left his most trusted general, Antipater, in charge of Macedon and Greece, and he would never again return to his homeland. As he prepared to cross, he performed a series of symbolic acts. He visited the ancient city of Troy, the site of the epic war described by his beloved Homer. He made sacrifices at the tomb of Achilles, the great hero he claimed as an ancestor on his mother's side. He was consciously casting himself as a new Achilles, embarking on a new Trojan war, but on a continental scale. He had his father's army, he had his father's plan, but he possessed an ambition and a belief in his own divine destiny that dwarfed even that of the great Philip. The son was now ready to finish what the father had started. In the spring of 334 BC, the world stood on the precipice of a new age. Alexander, now 21 years old, led his army to the Hellespont. the narrow strait that separated Europe from Asia, a symbolic boundary between the Greek world and the vast barbarian empire of Persia. He had assembled a force of approximately 47,000 men, a combined army of elite Macedonian veterans and allied Greek contingents. It was a relatively small force with which to challenge a global superpower, but it was an army forged into a perfect instrument of war by his father, Philip. Now, it was Alexander's to wield. The crossing itself was a masterful piece of propaganda and personal myth-making. Alexander did not simply ferry his troops across the water, he transformed the act into a sacred Homeric event. He personally steered his own flagship across the strait, and halfway to the Asian shore, he sacrificed a bull to the sea god Poseidon, pouring a golden libation to ensure safe passage. As his ship approached the coast, long before it landed, he put on his full, magnificent armor. He was the first man to leap ashore, casting a spear into the soil of Asia, symbolically claiming the entire continent as Spear-won territory, a prize to be taken by right of conquest. His first act on Asian soil was not to plan a battle, but to make a pilgrimage. He led a contingent of his men to the ruins of the ancient city of Troy, the hallowed ground of his favorite epic, the Iliad. He was consciously and publicly emulating his mythical ancestor, Achilles. He ran naked with his companions to honor the tomb of the great hero, dedicating his own armor at the temple of Athena and, in return, taking a sacred shield from the temple, which was said to have been used during the Trojan War. He would have this shield carried before him in all his future battles. This was not just piety, it was a powerful message to his Greek allies and his enemies. He was not merely a Macedonian king, he was the new Achilles, the leader of a united Greece, embarking on a new and even greater Trojan War to avenge the past and forge a new future. While Alexander was engaged in his symbolic quest, the Persian leadership in Asia Minor was gathering to meet him. The great king, Darius III, was still far away in the heart of his empire and did not yet grasp the true scale of the threat. The defense of Anatolia was left to the local satraps, the powerful governors of the western provinces. They assembled a formidable army near the town of Zelea, a force of around 40,000 men. At its core was a powerful contingent of elite Persian heavy cavalry, drawn from the sons of the local nobility, men who were fighting to defend their own lands and fortunes. They were supported by a large force of local infantry, but their most valuable asset was a solid, disciplined force of several thousand Greek mercenaries, battle-hardened veterans commanded by the brilliant and experienced general Memnon of Rhodes. Memnon, a Greek in Persian service, was the only commander in the Persian camp who truly understood the Macedonians. He knew their strengths, their discipline, and the terrifying genius of their new young king. He argued passionately for a scorched earth strategy. He knew that the Persian army, especially its cavalry, could not stand against Alexander's combined arms tactics in a pitched battle. He pleaded with the satraps to avoid a direct confrontation at all costs. Instead, he urged them to retreat inland, systematically burning crops, villages, and even cities. This, he argued, would deny the Macedonian army food and fodder. Alexander's invasion was operating on a shoestring budget. Without the ability to live off the land, his army would starve, their morale would collapse, and they would be forced into a humiliating retreat without a single major engagement. It was a sound, cautious and intelligent plan, the very strategy that would later be used to devastating effect against other great conquerors like Napoleon. But the Persian satraps were proud, arrogant men, lords of vast and wealthy estates. The idea of destroying their own rich lands and beautiful villas was abhorrent to them. Arsaces, the satrap of Hellespontine Phrygia, in whose territory they stood, declared that he would not allow a single house under his rule to be burned. Their pride was further stoked by their deep underestimation of their opponent. They saw Alexander not as the heir to Philip's genius, but as an arrogant boy king, an inexperienced youth leading a small army, whom they could easily crush in a single glorious battle. Spurred by jealousy and a desire for personal glory, they overruled Memnon. They would not run, they would not burn. They would make their stand at the next natural obstacle, the Granicus River, and there they would annihilate Alexander's army as it attempted to cross, sending the boy king's head back to the great king as a trophy. Their chosen position seemed perfect. The Granicus River, though not particularly wide or deep, had steep, treacherous banks and a swift, powerful current. They deployed their main force, the elite Persian cavalry, some 20,000 strong, directly on top of the riverbank. This was an unusual and tactically flawed decision. Orthodox military doctrine would have placed infantry on the bank to hold the crossing, with the cavalry in reserve on the flat ground behind to exploit any breakthrough. But the satraps were cavalrymen, and they wanted the glory of the first and final blow. They believed their elevated position would allow them to rain down javelins and then crush the Macedonians with a devastating downhill charge as they struggled out of the muddy water, disorganized and vulnerable. Behind them, on the flat ground of the plain, they placed their superb Greek mercenary infantry, confident that they would never even be needed. It was a plan born of pure arrogance, and it would prove to be a fatal mistake. When Alexander and his army arrived at the Granicus in the afternoon of May 334 BC, he immediately saw the Persian deployment. His most trusted and experienced general, the veteran Parmenion, was horrified by the enemy's strong position. He rode to Alexander and strongly advised him to wait. He argued that the sun was now in their eyes, the river was swift, the banks were steep, and the enemy was fresh and held the high ground. A frontal assault across the river, uphill, against a prepared line of elite cavalry, was not just reckless, it was suicidal. He begged his king to make camp, to rest the army, and to find a better crossing point to attack at dawn the next day. It was sound, cautious, conventional military wisdom. This was the first great test of Alexander's leadership, the first moment where he would have to choose between the caution of his father's generation and his own, almost supernatural, self-belief. He listened to the advice of his elder, and then completely rejected it. He scorned the idea of waiting, declaring with contempt that the Hellespont would blush for shame if, after crossing a sea, he was to be frightened by a mere stream. He knew that any hesitation, any sign of fear or weakness would be interpreted by the Persians as a victory and would embolden them. He would not give them a single night to grow more confident. He would attack, and he would attack now. The sheer audacity of the decision must have stunned his own commanders. What do you think? Was this a moment of strategic genius or youthful recklessness? Let us know your opinion in the comments below. Alexander quickly arranged his own forces for the assault. On his left flank, he placed his allied Greek and Thessalian cavalry under the command of the cautious Parmenion. Their job was to act as a pinning force, engaging the Persian right and preventing them from maneuvering. In the center, he positioned the unbreakable heart of his army, the 6 divisions of the Macedonian Phalanx, ready to cross the river and engage the Persian infantry reserve once the cavalry battle was decided. On the right flank, Alexander assembled his trump card. Here he placed his elite light infantry, the Hypaspists, his personal Agrianian skirmishers, and the finest cavalry in the world, the Royal Companion Cavalry. And in a move that electrified his men and terrified his enemies, he placed himself at the very front of the lead squadron, his magnificent armor and plumed helmet, making him an unmistakable target for the entire Persian army. He would not direct this battle from the rear. He would lead the charge himself. The battle began not with a full-scale assault, but with a clever sacrificial feint. Alexander ordered a small advance guard of cavalry and light infantry, led by an officer named Amyntas, to charge across the river first, upstream from his main position. This force was a deliberate lure. They plunged into the river and were immediately swarmed by the Persian cavalry on the bank, who converged on the point of attack, believing this to be the main assault. The fighting was brutal. The Macedonians, struggling up the muddy bank, were overwhelmed by the Persians charging downhill. They were driven back with heavy losses, but they had done their job perfectly. They had drawn the attention of the Persian command, disrupted their perfect line, and fixed their best units in place. While the Persians were distracted by this bloody sideshow, Alexander made his move. He led the Companion Cavalry in their iconic wedge formation, not at the point of the first attack, but diagonally across the river, aiming for the newly weakened center-left of the Persian cavalry line, where the Persian high command was located. With a loud war cry to his patron god, Heracles, he plunged his horse Bucephalus into the churning water, his men following him without hesitation. They scrambled across the river and up the steep, muddy bank, a chaotic, desperate climb into a hail of Persian javelins, their horses slipping and sliding as they fought for a foothold. The moment the companions hit the top of the bank, the battle descended into a brutal, close-quarters cavalry melee. The Macedonians, with their longer, tougher cornel wood lances, had a distinct advantage over the Persians with their lighter javelins, which often shattered on the bronze armor of the companions. But the fighting was a furious, chaotic tangle of men and horses. It was here that Alexander, leading from the very front, fought like a hero from the pages of Homer, and it was here that his life was nearly cut short at the very beginning of his journey. He sought out the Persian commanders, his colorful plumes making him an easy target. He charged at Mithridates, Darius's son-in-law, and killed him with a single thrust of his lance to the face. But as he did, he was attacked by 2 other Persian satraps, Rosices and Spithridates. His own lance shattered in the melee. He fought on with his sword, but he was surrounded. Rosices rode up and struck him on the head with a battle axe. The blow was so powerful that it sheared off the crest of his helmet and cracked the helmet itself, dazing him and cutting a wound in his scalp. As Rosices prepared to deliver the final killing blow, the other satrap, Spithridates, raised his scimitar to strike Alexander from behind. In that split second, with the king stunned and defenseless, the fate of the entire invasion hung by a thread. But one of Alexander's commanders, Clytus the Black, saw the danger. He galloped in, and with a single powerful stroke of his own sword, sliced off Spithridates' upraised arm at the shoulder, saving the king's life. Alexander, recovering his senses, quickly dispatched Rosaces with his sword. The entire dramatic episode lasted only a few heart-stopping seconds. The death of several of their commanders in personal combat with Alexander and the sheer unstoppable ferocity of his personal charge shattered the morale of the Persian cavalry. Their line broke, first in the center where Alexander was fighting, then across their entire front. They turned and fled in a panic-stricken rout. The Macedonian cavalry, now in control of the riverbank, relentlessly pursued them across the plain, cutting them down as they ran. With the Persian cavalry gone, their Greek mercenary infantry, who had been held in reserve and had watched the entire disaster unfold without ever engaging, were now left alone and exposed on the plain. Alexander, showing a cold, calculating ruthlessness, reformed his forces. He brought up his phalanx, which had now crossed the river and completely surrounded the mercenaries. The mercenaries, professional soldiers caught in a hopeless situation, tried to negotiate a surrender, hoping for honorable terms as fellow Greeks. But Alexander was in no mood for mercy. He saw them not as honorable opponents caught in a difficult position, but as traitors to the pan-Hellenic cause, Greeks who had taken Persian gold to fight against their own countrymen. In his eyes, their crime was unforgivable, and he was determined to make a terrifying example of them. He refused any terms. He ordered his phalanx to advance, and what followed was a horrific one-sided massacre. The surrounded mercenaries, numbering several thousand, fought with the desperation of men with no escape. But they were helpless. The Macedonian phalanx advanced from all sides, a slowly closing circle of death. The mercenaries were faced with an impenetrable forest of 18-foot Sarissa pikes. Trapped and unable to get close enough to use their shorter spears effectively, they were systematically slaughtered. The ancient historian Arrian described it as a massacre. The phalanx, bristling with pikes, advanced, and the cavalry charged into their crumbling ranks. Of the thousands of mercenaries, only a handful survived to be taken prisoner. These survivors were chained and sent back to Macedon to work in the mines as slaves, a brutal and ignominious end for professional Greek soldiers. The Battle of the Granicus was a total and overwhelming victory for Alexander. In a single bloody afternoon, he had destroyed the entire Persian field army in Asia Minor and had either killed or put to flight all the regional satraps who had opposed him. He had achieved this through a combination of audacious risk-taking, brilliant tactical timing, and inspirational personal leadership that bordered on the divine. The cost was minimal. Ancient sources claim perhaps just over 100 Macedonians were killed, a number that seems impossibly low but speaks to the decisiveness of the victory. The Persians, by contrast, had lost thousands of their best cavalry and their entire mercenary infantry. In the aftermath, Alexander showed the political genius that would become as legendary as his military skill. He buried his own dead with full military honors and visited the wounded personally. He granted tax exemption to the families of the fallen. To reinforce the idea of a pan-Hellenic crusade, he gathered 300 suits of captured Persian armor and sent them back to Athens as a votive offering to be hung in the Parthenon with the inscription, "Alexander, son of Philip and the Greeks, except the Lacedaemonians, the Spartans, from the barbarians who live in Asia." It was a masterful piece of propaganda that both celebrated the victory and subtly shamed his Spartan rivals for their refusal to join him. The victory at the Granicus was more than just a military triumph. It was a psychological earthquake. It shattered the myth of Persian invincibility and sent a shockwave through the empire. The Greek cities of Ionia, seeing the power of the satraps broken, began to open their gates to him, hailing him as a liberator. Alexander had not just won a battle, he had won the entire western coast of Asia Minor. He had passed his first great test with terrifying success, and the world had been put on notice. The boy king was a force of nature, and the gates to the east were now wide open. The news of the disaster at the Granicus River echoed like a thunderclap across the vast expanse of the Persian Empire. The local satraps, the first line of defense, had been annihilated. Their armies were scattered, their authority broken, and the entire western coast of Asia Minor was now falling, city by city, into the hands of the young Macedonian invader. The boy king was no longer a minor nuisance. He was a mortal threat. In his magnificent palace in Babylon, the great king, Darius III, ruler of an empire that stretched from Egypt to India, could no longer afford to delegate. The time had come for the King of Kings to take the field himself. Darius III was a man of considerable stature. He had come to the throne through a period of intense court intrigue and murder, proving his own personal courage in a duel against a rebellious chieftain. He was a capable administrator and a respected, if not feared, ruler of the world's first true superpower. He now called upon the full, terrifying might of his empire. He issued a levy, a call to arms that reached every corner of his domain. From the plains of Mesopotamia, the mountains of Iran, and the far eastern satrapies, soldiers began to march. For over a year, he gathered a new, colossal army at Babylon, a force designed not just to defeat Alexander, but to utterly obliterate him. Ancient sources, as they often do, exaggerate the numbers to almost comical levels, claiming an army of over 600,000 men. A more realistic modern estimate would place Darius's field army at around 100,000 soldiers, but even this conservative number represented a force more than double the size of Alexander's. It was a multi-ethnic spectacle of imperial power. At its heart was the elite of the Persian military, a massive contingent of superb heavy cavalry, 10,000 of the legendary royal bodyguards, known as the Immortals, and, most importantly, a huge and highly disciplined force of 30,000 Greek mercenaries. These were professional soldiers, hoplites who represented the best infantry that money could buy, and they would form the solid, unbreakable center of Darius's battle line. This was the Grand Army of the Persian Empire, a force of breathtaking scale and opulence. Accompanying it was a vast baggage train, carrying not just the necessities of war, but the luxuries of the royal court. Darius marched to war not as a soldier, but as a king. His entourage included his entire family, his mother Sisygambis, his wife Statira, and his children, as well as a host of courtiers, officials, and a treasury filled with gold and silver. There was no doubt in his mind, or in the minds of his commanders, that this campaign would end in a swift and glorious victory. In the autumn of 333 BC, this magnificent, seemingly invincible host marched west into Syria, ready to hunt down and destroy the Macedonian upstart. While Darius was mustering his grand army, Alexander had spent the year marching through Asia Minor, a campaign of astonishing speed and strategic brilliance. He secured the coastline, neutralizing the Persian navy by capturing its ports. He then marched into the rugged interior. It was here, in the ancient city of Gordium, that he encountered the legendary Gordian knot, a complex knot of rope tied to an ancient chariot. An oracle had prophesied that whoever could untie it would rule all of Asia. After struggling with it for a moment, Alexander, in a display of his characteristic direct approach, declared, "It matters not how it is loosed," and with a single powerful stroke of his sword, cut it in half. For his men and allies, it was a stunning omen, a sign of his destiny. For a more detailed look at this legendary story and his year of conquest, be sure to check out our full documentary, Alexander versus the World, the Man Who Conquered History. Now, Alexander marched south, seeking the decisive battle that would break the Persian Empire's power. He fell ill for a time, delaying his advance, but once recovered, he pushed on towards the mountain passes that separated Asia Minor from Syria, a series of narrow choke points known as the Syrian Gates. He knew Darius's grand army was near, and he intended to meet them on ground of his own choosing. It was at this point that a strategic game of cat and mouse began, a game that would lead to one of the most stunning reversals of fortune in military history. Alexander marched his army through the Syrian gates and continued south along the coast, expecting to meet Darius on the wide plains of Syria, where a great battle would be fought. But Darius was not where Alexander expected him to be. The great king, advised by his generals, had taken a different, more northerly route. He had marched his own army through a different mountain pass, the Ammanic Gates. In a stunning turn of events, the two armies, screened by the mountains, completely missed each other, like two ships passing in the night. Darius's massive force emerged from the mountains and descended upon the town of Issus, which Alexander had just left behind. Issus was serving as the Macedonians' rear supply depot and hospital. Darius captured it without a fight, in an act of shocking brutality that revealed his growing frustration. He had the sick and wounded Macedonian soldiers who had been left there tortured and then brutally executed. For Darius, this was the perfect scenario. He had successfully and brilliantly outmaneuvered the great Alexander. He now stood between the Macedonian army and their supply lines back to Greece. The boy king was cut off, isolated deep in enemy territory, and trapped. Darius's advisors, especially the experienced Greek mercenary Amyntas, begged him to capitalize on his perfect strategic position. They argued that he should hold his ground, to wait for Alexander on the wide, open plains near Issus. The ground was perfect for his superior numbers and his powerful cavalry. Here, he could simply wait. The Macedonians were now the ones who would be forced to attack, to turn around and march north to break out of the trap. They would be exhausted, demoralized, and would have to fight on ground that gave every advantage to the Persians. It was a foolproof plan. But Darius, like the satraps at Granicus, was a victim of his own arrogance. He was surrounded by fawning courtiers who told him that Alexander was terrified, that the Macedonians were already in flight, and that the young king would not dare to turn and face the magnificent army of the great king. Darius, his ego inflated and eager for the personal glory of crushing the young invader himself, ignored the sound advice of his mercenary generals. Convinced that he could annihilate the Macedonians in a single decisive blow, he made a catastrophic strategic blunder. He abandoned his advantageous position on the open plain and marched his entire army south down the narrow coastal plain, seeking to pin Alexander against the sea. He would give battle at the Pinarus River, in a space so constricted that it would completely neutralize his greatest advantage, his overwhelming numbers. When Alexander's scouts brought him the shocking news that Darius was now behind him, his men were gripped by fear. They were cut off, their line of retreat severed, isolated deep in hostile territory. But Alexander, upon hearing the news, was overjoyed. The historian Arrian tells us that he gathered his commanders and gave a speech brimming with confidence. He saw the situation not as a trap for him, but as a gift from the gods. The gods themselves, he declared, are on our side, for they have put it into the mind of Darius to abandon the open plains and cram his great army into this narrow space. He knew that Darius's blunder had negated his numerical superiority. The battle would not be decided by who had more men, but by who had the better men. And in that contest, Alexander had no doubt of the outcome. He immediately ordered his army to turn around and march north to meet their destiny. The battlefield at Issus was a narrow strip of land, barely 1.5 miles wide, caught between the Amanus Mountains on one side and the Mediterranean Sea on the other. Through the middle of this plain flowed the Pinarus River, its steep banks providing a natural defensive line. It was here that Darius deployed his massive army. He placed his best heavy infantry, the 30,000 Greek mercenaries, in the center to hold the riverbank, a solid wall of professional soldiers. His finest heavy cavalry was massed on his right, along the coast, where the ground was flattest and most open for a charge. The rest of his vast force, tens of thousands of lighter infantry called Kardakis, were packed into the Persian left and center, extending up the foothills of the mountains. In front of the entire line, he placed a screen of archers and skirmishers. Darius himself took his position in the traditional place of the Persian kings, in the absolute center of the army, surrounded by his 10,000 elite royal bodyguards, the legendary Immortals. From his magnificent war chariot, he was ready to command his seemingly invincible host to a glorious victory. Alexander, having turned his army around, marched to meet him. He deployed his own forces with meticulous care. On his left flank, facing the powerful Persian cavalry by the sea, he placed his Thessalian cavalry, commanded by his trusted general, Parmenion. He gave Parmenion one crucial order: hold your ground at all costs. The fate of the entire battle could depend on that flank not breaking. In the center, he placed the unbreakable heart of his army, the Macedonian Phalanx. These 6 divisions of heavily armored infantry, armed with their terrifying 18-foot Sarissa pikes, formed a solid wall of steel points. On his right flank, extending towards the foothills, Alexander positioned his elite hypaspists, his light infantry, and most importantly, the finest cavalry in the world, the Companion Cavalry, which he would lead personally. Seeing that the Persian line extended further than his own and threatened to envelop him from the mountains, Alexander made a final, brilliant adjustment. He held back a portion of his infantry and light cavalry at a 45-degree angle behind his right wing. This refused flank acted as a tactical hinge, ready to pivot and counter any Persian attempt to surround him. With his dispositions made, Alexander rode along the front of his army, inspiring his men with his presence before taking his place at the head of the Companion Cavalry. The battle began on Alexander's right. He gave the order, and the companions began to advance, not straight ahead, but at an oblique angle, moving across the front of the Persian line. This diagonal advance was a classic Alexandrian tactic designed to probe for weakness and create confusion. The Persian infantry on the opposite foothills, seeing this flanking movement, charged down to intercept them. disrupting their own formation in the process. Alexander seized the moment. As the Persian left began to move and lose its cohesion, he saw his opening. He immediately wheeled the companions into their devastating wedge formation and led them in a thunderous charge, not at the infantry in the hills, but directly across the Pinarus River and into the flank of the Persian left center where the Kardakis stood. The shock of the charge was overwhelming. The lightly armored Persian infantry, hit from an unexpected angle by the best heavy cavalry in the world, shattered and fled. While Alexander was achieving a stunning breakthrough on the right, the situation in the center was far more perilous. The Macedonian Phalanx, charging across the river, had its own disciplined formation disrupted by the steep, slippery riverbanks. As they struggled up the opposite side, they were met by Darius's best troops, the battle-hardened Greek mercenaries. A brutal, desperate struggle ensued in the center, a horrific shoving match of shield against shield and spear against spear. For a terrifying moment, the Macedonian Phalanx, the anchor of Alexander's army, began to buckle. A crisis was developing. But Alexander was not done. Having routed the Persian left, he did not pursue them. Instead, he demonstrated his incredible battlefield awareness and discipline, a quality that separated him from nearly every other commander of the ancient world. He rallied the companions and wheeled them around, leading them in a second, devastating charge. This time, he smashed into the exposed flank of the Greek mercenaries who were pressing his own phalanx so hard. Attacked from the front by the irresistible pikes of the phalanx, and now from the side by Alexander's elite cavalry, the mercenaries' line, which had been on the verge of victory, finally collapsed. With his left wing and his elite center now broken, Darius saw the battle turning against him. He had watched the Macedonian cavalry tear through his lines. He had seen his best infantry, the mercenaries he had paid a fortune for, being cut to pieces. And then he saw the whirlwind of battle coming directly for him. Alexander, having broken the mercenaries, was now leading the companions in a third, relentless charge, aimed like a spear at one man, and one man only, Darius himself. The sight of the fearsome young king, his armor gleaming, his face a mask of furious determination, covered in the dust and blood of battle, charging straight for his chariot, was too much. The great king's nerve broke. He had seen this happen to others, but he never imagined it would happen to him. He turned his magnificent chariot and fled the field in a panic. The flight of the king was the signal for a total collapse. The Persian army, seeing their leader abandon them, lost all will to fight. The entire force dissolved into a panicked mob, each man running for his own life, desperate to escape the narrow plain that had become a death trap. They were mercilessly hunted down by the victorious Macedonians. On the other flank, Parmenians, Thessalians, having held their ground against the powerful Persian cavalry, now launched their own counterattack, completing the rout. Darius, in his haste to escape, abandoned everything. He reportedly threw off his royal cloak, his bow, and his shield to lighten the load of his chariot, thinking only of his own survival. Left behind in the royal camp was his mother, Sisigambis, his wife Stateira, his young son, and his daughters. They were now prisoners of the young king they had been told was a barbarian. The next day, Alexander, having returned from his pursuit of Darius, learned that the Persian royal family was in his camp and believed that they were all to be executed. He sent one of his officers with a message. "Tell them that Darius lives, and that they have nothing to fear from Alexander. I do not make war on women and children." He then visited the royal tent himself. Upon his entrance, Darius's mother, Sisygambis, mistaking the taller and more handsome Hephaestion for the king, prostrated herself before him. Hephaestion stepped back in embarrassment, but Alexander, in a moment of incredible grace, helped the old woman to her feet and said, "Do not worry, mother, for he too is Alexander." This act of chivalry was a calculated masterstroke of propaganda. He treated the captured royal family not as spoils of war, but with the utmost respect and compassion, promising to care for them and treat them as royalty. News of his merciful treatment spread like wildfire throughout the Persian Empire, contrasting his image as a noble and magnanimous leader with that of Darius, the king who had cowardly abandoned his own family to save himself. The psychological blow to Darius's prestige was immense. He was no longer just a defeated king, he was a dishonored one. The Battle of Issus was a staggering victory for Alexander. He had faced the grand army of the Persian Empire, led by the great king himself, and had utterly annihilated it. The path to the heart of the Persian Empire, to Syria, Phoenicia, and Egypt, was now wide open. The balance of power in the ancient world had shifted irrevocably in a single afternoon. 2 years passed between the humiliation at Issus and the final apocalyptic confrontation. For Alexander, these were years of relentless strategic consolidation. He marched south, methodically securing the entire Mediterranean coast to neutralize the Persian navy once and for all. This campaign culminated in the legendary 7-month-long siege of Tyre, one of the most incredible feats of military engineering in history. Faced with an impregnable island fortress, Alexander did the unthinkable. He built a massive stone causeway nearly half a mile long through the sea itself to reach the city's walls. The brutal sack of Tyre sent a terrifying message to the world. No fortress was safe, no city could defy him. From there, he marched into Egypt, where he was not seen as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Egyptians, who had long chafed under Persian rule, welcomed him with open arms, crowning him as their new pharaoh. It was here that he founded the great city of Alexandria, a future center of world learning. And it was here that he made a pilgrimage deep into the desert to the Oracle of Siwa, where the priests reportedly greeted him as the son of the god Ammon, confirming his own deep-seated belief in his divine destiny. While Alexander was being hailed as a god, Darius III was preparing for his final stand as a king. He had been profoundly shamed by his flight at Issus, but he was not yet broken. He sent Alexander offers of peace, a king's ransom in gold, all the lands west of the Euphrates River, and even his own daughter's hand in marriage. When Alexander's most trusted general, Parmenion, heard the terms, he famously said, "If I were Alexander, I would accept." Alexander's legendary reply revealed the true terrifying scale of his ambition. So would I, if I were Parmenion. For Alexander, this was not about territory, it was about destiny. He wanted it all. His offer scorned, Darius knew there would be no more negotiations. This would be a winner-take-all contest for the fate of the world. He spent those 2 years mustering the full, terrifying might of his empire, determined to crush the Macedonian upstart once and for all. He issued a levy that reached the furthest corners of his domain. From the mountains of Bactria and Sogdiana, from the plains of India, from the heart of Persia and Media, a new, colossal army began to assemble at Babylon. This force would be even larger and more formidable than the one at Issus. Ancient sources speak of 1 million men, A more sober modern estimate places the number at around 250,000 soldiers, but even this conservative figure represents a force that would outnumber Alexander's army by at least 5-1. This was a true imperial host, a breathtaking spectacle of power. At its heart was the elite of the Persian military, a massive contingent of superb heavy cavalry, the 10,000 legendary immortals, and this time, a full complement of Greek mercenaries. But Darius had also gathered specialized, terrifying units from across his empire. From his eastern provinces, he brought 15 Indian war elephants, titanic beasts trained to trample and terrorize enemy infantry, a sight most of Alexander's men had never seen. From the vast steppes of Central Asia, he summoned the feared Scythian horse archers, the masters of hit-and-run warfare. And he had a new terror weapon. Convinced that his defeat at Issus was due to the terrain, Darius chose his new battlefield with meticulous care. He would not be caught in a narrow pass again. He selected a wide, perfectly flat plain near the village of Gaugamela in modern-day Iraq. This was his ideal killing ground, a place where his overwhelming numbers and, most importantly, his cavalry could operate without restriction. He was so confident in his plan that he even had his engineers level the ground, clearing it of any shrubs or hills that might impede the charge of his ultimate weapon, 200 scythed chariots. These were heavy, 4-horse chariots, fitted with long, razor-sharp blades extending from the wheels, designed to slice through infantry formations like a gruesome scythe through wheat. On this perfect, prepared field, with this immense and terrifying army, Darius believed his victory was not just likely, it was a mathematical certainty. In the late summer of 331 BC, Alexander marched his army of 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry out of Syria, deep into the heart of the Persian Empire. His scouts soon brought him news of the colossal army Darius had assembled and the perfectly prepared battlefield that awaited them. As the two armies made camp, the contrast between them on the eve of battle was stark. The Persian camp was a veritable city of noise and light, a nervous buzz of 250,000 men preparing for battle. Fearing a surprise night attack from the audacious Macedonian king, Darius made a fateful decision. He ordered his entire army to remain awake and in formation all night long. Torches burned across the plain as the sleepless, anxious, and increasingly exhausted army waited for a dawn they dreaded. The Macedonian camp, by contrast, was quiet and dark. Alexander, against the urgent advice of his generals, refused to even consider a night attack. He famously declared, "I will not steal my victory." He understood that a chaotic night battle would negate his own army's greatest strengths, its discipline and tactical cohesion. He ordered his men to eat a full meal and get a good night's sleep. He exuded an aura of absolute confidence that spread like a contagion throughout his army. While the Persian king stood a nervous vigil over his exhausted troops, Alexander the Great, on the eve of the most important battle of his life, slept soundly in his tent as if it were any other day. When he awoke, refreshed and clear-headed, he gathered his commanders to lay out his plan, a masterpiece of tactical genius designed to counter every one of Darius's advantages. He knew a direct frontal assault against an army 5 times his size was suicide. Instead, he would use deception, speed, and precision to create a single, decisive point of weakness. He would advance in an oblique or diagonal formation. He would lead his elite right wing, the hypaspists and the Companion Cavalry, forward at a 45-degree angle, moving towards the edge of the prepared battlefield. seemingly trying to outflank the vast Persian line. This unorthodox advance, he calculated, would force the Persian left wing to move to counter him. It would stretch their line, disrupt their cohesion, and, he hoped, create a momentary gap between their cavalry and their infantry center. To counter the immense threat of being enveloped by the massive Persian army, Alexander designed a brilliant defense in depth. He arranged his troops in what was essentially a large, open-ended rectangle. Behind his main phalanx, he placed a second line of infantry at an angle, ready to turn and face any flanking attack from the Persian right. This reserve line was his insurance policy, a revolutionary innovation that could turn his formation into a defensive box, capable of fighting in multiple directions at once. It was a strategy that showed both his respect for the enemy's numbers and his absolute confidence in his own men's ability to execute complex maneuvers under pressure. Finally, he had a specific and psychologically brilliant plan for the scythed chariots. He ordered the front ranks of his infantry not to stand firm, but to open gaps in their formation at the very last second. He told them to shout, to bang their spears on their shields, and to create terrifying channels of noise and death for the chariots to pass harmlessly through. Men stationed in the rear would then hurl javelins at the horses and drivers, neutralizing the threat from behind. It was a plan that required immense discipline, courage, and a level of trust between a commander and his men that was almost unheard of in the ancient world. With the plan set, the Macedonians marched onto the field, a small, disciplined island of bronze and steel in a vast sea of the Persian Empire. The battle began with Alexander leading his right wing forward in his planned oblique advance. The entire Macedonian line moved in perfect unison, like a single, living organism, drifting further and further to the right. Darius, watching from his chariot in the center, grew anxious. He saw Alexander's wing moving towards the edge of the leveled ground he had so carefully prepared for his chariots. Fearing that Alexander would succeed in flanking him, or that the battle would move to unprepared ground, he ordered his Scythian and Bactrian cavalry on his left to charge and halt the Macedonian advance. A massive and brutal cavalry battle erupted on the right flank, with thousands of horsemen crashing together in a chaotic cloud of dust and steel. Believing the Macedonian lines were now engaged and fixed, Darius unleashed his ultimate weapon, the scythed chariots. They thundered across the plain, a terrifying wall of noise and flashing blades, aimed directly at the heart of the Macedonian phalanx. But Alexander's plan worked to perfection. The veteran infantry, drilled for this very moment, held their nerve. At the last second, they opened their ranks, creating wide channels. They banged their spears on their shields, creating a deafening roar. The chariots, their horses panicked by the noise and seeking the path of least resistance, were funneled harmlessly through the gaps. Once inside the formation, they were picked off by javelins and swordsmen from the rear and sides. The terror weapon, which should have been a battle winner, had been turned into a triviality, its failure a major psychological blow to the Persian army. While this was happening on the Macedonian left flank, the situation was becoming desperate. Alexander's second-in-command, the old general Parmenion, was facing the full might of the Persian right-wing cavalry, led by the satrap Mazaeus. Parmenion was massively outnumbered and was being pushed back. The Persian cavalry was on the verge of breaking through his line and enveloping the entire Macedonian army from the rear. He sent a desperate rider to Alexander, begging for reinforcements. But Alexander was focused on the center. His diagonal advance had done exactly what he had hoped. As the Persian left flank cavalry had charged out to meet him, they had pulled away from their own infantry. A fatal gap had opened in the Persian line, directly between their left wing and their center where Darius stood. This was the moment Alexander had been waiting for, the single point of weakness in the Persian behemoth. He had used his own flank as bait to create his opportunity. Without a moment's hesitation, Alexander disengaged from the cavalry fight on the flank. He rallied the Companion Cavalry, forming them into a giant, perfectly formed wedge with himself at its very tip. He abandoned the fight on the wing and, in a move of breathtaking audacity, charged directly into the gap, a human spear aimed at one target, and one target only, Darius III. The companions, armed with their deadly 12-foot Xyston lances, crashed through the weakened Persian line, shattering the royal guard infantry and riding straight for the great king's magnificent war chariot. For a moment, the two kings were within sight of each other. Alexander, the warrior king, covered in dust and blood, a figure of seemingly supernatural fury, leading the charge from the front. Darius, the emperor, a remote, godlike figure on a magnificent war chariot, suddenly found the whirlwind of battle at his doorstep. Javelins fell around him. His royal guards, the immortals themselves, were being cut to pieces by the lances of the companions. The sight of Alexander himself, a man he must have now believed was more than mortal, was too much. He had seen this before at Issus. The terror, the humiliation, the utter disbelief of it happening again broke Darius's nerve. Convinced the battle was lost, he did the one thing a great king should never do. He turned his chariot and fled the field, leaving his army to its fate. The flight of the great king had a catastrophic and immediate effect. Word spread like wildfire through the Persian center and left wing. The king has fled. The king has fled. The morale of the army, already strained by the failure of the chariots and the breakthrough of the companions, collapsed completely. The vast formations, which had seemed so invincible just an hour before, dissolved as soldiers threw down their weapons and ran for their lives. The battle on that side of the field had turned into a complete and utter rout. Alexander and his companions were in hot pursuit of Darius, with the ultimate prize, the capture of the Persian king, within their grasp. This was his chance to end the war, to capture the king and become the undisputed ruler of the world. But at that very moment, the desperate message from Parmenion finally reached him. The left flank was crumbling. The Persian cavalry under Mazaeus, who had fought with great courage and skill, had broken through the Macedonian line and were now attacking the Macedonian camp in the rear, threatening to capture their baggage and cut off their line of retreat. Parmenion's wing was on the verge of annihilation. Alexander was faced with a terrible choice, a choice that would define his character as a leader. He could continue his glorious pursuit of Darius, a chase that would cement his personal glory and end the war on the spot. Or he could abandon his prize, turn back from the threshold of ultimate victory, and save his men and his army from annihilation. It was a defining moment. He chose his men. Cursing his luck, his face a mask of fury and frustration, Alexander halted the pursuit. He rallied the companions and wheeled them around, giving up the chase for Darius to charge back into the fray and relieve his beleaguered left flank. They smashed into the rear of the triumphant Persian cavalry, who, caught completely by surprise while looting the Macedonian camp, were themselves trapped between Alexander's charge and Parmenion's reforming lines. They too were routed. Alexander had saved his army. With both flanks now broken, the rout of the Persian army was absolute. The Macedonians hunted the fleeing soldiers across the plain, a slaughter that lasted for the rest of the day. The riches found in the Persian camp were beyond comprehension: mounds of gold and silver, luxurious tents, and Darius's personal war chariot and bow, abandoned in his haste. The casualties were staggering. While Alexander may have lost only a few hundred men, tens of thousands, perhaps even 100,000 Persian soldiers lay dead on the field of Gaugamela. The greatest army the ancient world had ever seen had ceased to exist. The Battle of Gaugamela was not merely a victory, it was an apocalypse for the Persian Empire. The colossal army that Darius had spent 2 years gathering was no more, its remnants scattered to the winds. The authority of the great king, already fractured after Issus, was now irrevocably shattered. There would be no more grand armies, no more final stands. The heart of the empire was now defenseless, its legendary cities lying open and vulnerable to the conqueror. Alexander, his victory absolute, marched his army south towards the greatest prize of all, the city of Babylon. For centuries, Babylon had been the largest, wealthiest, and most magnificent city in the known world. Its famed ziggurats and hanging gardens were wonders of the ancient world. It was a global center of commerce, astronomy, and culture. As Alexander and his weary army approached, they did not know what to expect. Would they face a desperate siege? Would the city's defenders fight to the death? Instead, they were met with a scene of overwhelming celebration. The gates of the city were thrown open. The Persian satrap, Macedon, the same man who had fought so bravely against Parmenion at Gaugamela, surrendered the city without a fight. The populace of Babylon, who had long viewed the Persians as foreign rulers, lined the streets, cheering, burning incense, and throwing flowers, hailing Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator who had freed them from the Persian yoke. Alexander, in a display of the political acumen that matched his military genius, played the part perfectly. He made sacrifices to the Babylonian god Marduk, ordering the temples that the Persians had neglected to be rebuilt. He confirmed Macedon as the governor of the province, a stunning act of clemency that showed he intended to rule not as a Macedonian overlord, but as a king of all peoples. He rested his army in the opulent city for over a month, allowing them to indulge in the luxuries and pleasures they had earned after years of brutal campaigning. From Babylon, he marched to Susa, another of the great Persian capitals, where he seized the imperial treasury, a fortune so immense, some 50,000 talents of silver, that it would fund his ambitions for years to come and fundamentally reshape the economy of the ancient world. But his final destination was the spiritual and ceremonial heart of the empire, Persepolis. This was no mere administrative capital. It was a sacred city, a magnificent complex of palaces and temples built by Darius the Great and his son, Xerxes, the very king who had invaded Greece over a century earlier. It was a symbol of Persian power, glory, and, in the eyes of the Greeks, arrogance. After allowing his troops to savagely loot the city, Alexander committed one of the most debated and controversial acts of his life. In the spring of 330 BC, during a grand victory feast, he ordered the magnificent palace complex, one of the architectural wonders of the world, to be burned to the ground. The motivations behind this act of cultural vandalism are still debated by historians. Was it, as some ancient sources like Plutarch suggest, a drunken act of impulse, egged on by the Athenian courtesan Thais during the wild celebrations? Or was it a cold, calculated political act? Most historians now lean towards the latter. The burning of Persepolis was the ultimate symbol that the Achaemenid dynasty was finished. It was the final, dramatic act of the Pan-Hellenic War of Revenge, a brutally clear and terrifyingly direct payback for the burning of the Acropolis in Athens by the Persian king Xerxes 150 years earlier. It was a message written in fire to the entire world. The old order was dead. The age of Persia was over. The age of Alexander had begun. While the symbolic heart of his empire smoldered in ruins, Darius III was now a fugitive, a king in name only, fleeing eastward into the remote satrapies of Bactria and Sogdiana. Alexander, his act of revenge complete, now embarked on the final phase of his conquest, the pursuit of the fugitive king. This was more than just a hunt for one man. It was a high-speed campaign to secure the vast eastern provinces of the Persian Empire before they could rally around a new leader. Alexander pushed his men at an incredible pace, covering huge distances in his relentless pursuit. He was driven by a need to capture Darius alive, to receive a formal surrender, and legitimize his own claim to the Persian throne. Darius, now a pathetic and broken figure, fled from city to city, his authority evaporating with every mile. His own noblemen and satraps, led by a powerful Bactrian governor named Bessus, who was also a relative of Darius, saw him as a failure and an obstacle. They had lost all respect for the king who had twice fled from battle. They hatched a conspiracy. In a final act of betrayal, they arrested their own king, placing him in golden chains in an ox cart, and continued the flight, intending to either hand him over to Alexander to win favor, or to kill him and lead a new war of resistance themselves. When Alexander received word of this betrayal, he pushed his small contingent of cavalry to the absolute limits of human and equine endurance, riding for days with almost no rest, desperate to save his rival. He finally closed in on the conspirators' trail. Bessus and his followers, seeing Alexander's vanguard approaching, knew they could not escape with their royal prisoner. They gave Darius a choice: mount a horse and continue the flight with them or die. When he refused, they stabbed him with their javelins and left him to die on the side of the road as they fled into the mountains. Alexander and his men arrived moments later to find the once mighty king of kings, the ruler of the world's greatest empire, lying in the dust, bleeding to death. A Macedonian soldier reportedly gave him a final drink of water. Alexander, upon seeing the body of his great rival, was said to have been genuinely moved. He removed his own royal cloak and covered Darius's body, a profound gesture of respect for a fallen king. He sent Darius's body back to Persepolis to be buried with full royal honors in the tomb of his ancestors, and vowed that he would hunt down and punish the kingslayers. This was not just chivalry, it was a shrewd and necessary political act. By honoring Darius in death and vowing to avenge him, Alexander was positioning himself not as a foreign conqueror who had overthrown a legitimate king, but as the rightful successor to the Achaemenid throne, who was now tasked with restoring order and punishing traitors. The Achaemenid Empire, which had been founded by Cyrus the Great 2 centuries earlier, had ended not with a final glorious battle, but with a pathetic bloody betrayal in a remote desert pass. The conquest of the Persian Empire marks the climax of a story that truly began not with Alexander, but with his father. To understand the legacy of the Macedonian conquest, one must understand the inseparable two-act drama of Philip and Alexander. They were two sides of the same coin, a father and son whose combined genius and ambition remade the world. Their relationship was often stormy and contentious, but their legacies are inextricably linked. Philip was the architect of the revolution. He was the pragmatist, the master strategist, the political realist. He was a man of incredible patience and foresight who spent 20 years painstakingly building his kingdom and his army from nothing. He inherited a failed state and transformed it into a superpower. He saw the fatal weaknesses in the Greek way of war and created a new military system that was 2 generations ahead of its time. He forged the Sarissa Phalanx, perfected combined arms, and drilled his men into a professional, loyal force. Philip was the smith who forged the sword, a perfect, unstoppable weapon of conquest. He united Greece, a feat no one had ever accomplished, providing the stable platform and the pan-Hellenic justification for the great invasion. But his ambition, though vast, was ultimately conventional: to defeat Persia, enrich Macedon, and secure his own place in history. Alexander was the wielder of that sword. He was the romantic, the visionary, a man who saw no borders, only horizons. Where Philip was a master of grand strategy, Alexander was a master of the battlefield, a tactical genius with an almost supernatural intuition and an appetite for risk that bordered on the divine. He inherited his father's perfect army, and with it, he unleashed a whirlwind of conquest that the world had never seen. While Philip's ambition was to defeat Persia, Alexander's was to become Persia, to reach the ends of the world, to merge East and West into a single, universal empire. He was driven not just by a lust for power, but by a profound sense of destiny, a belief in his own divinity that pushed him to achieve what no mortal had ever even dreamed of. The father's genius was in the preparation, the long, patient years of building the machine. The son's genius was in the execution, the audacious, high-stakes gambles that shattered an empire in just a few short years. Philip created the army. Alexander gave it its immortal legend. Without Philip's reforms, Alexander would have been just another ambitious prince of a minor kingdom. Without Alexander's boundless ambition and tactical brilliance, Philip's army might have won a few border provinces from Persia, but it would have never conquered the known world. Together, they represent one of the most potent and consequential father-son dynasties in all of human history. The final legacy of the Macedonian conquest is the new world it created. The victories of Philip and Alexander did more than just transfer power from one dynasty to another. They shattered the old paradigms of the classical world and gave violent birth to a new cosmopolitan era, the Hellenistic Age. The traditional world of the small, independent, and culturally distinct Greek city-state, the world of Athens and Sparta, was over. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, the superpower that had defined the political landscape of the East for over 2 centuries, was also consigned to history. In their place rose a new, vast, interconnected world, a world where Greek was spoken from the shores of Italy to the mountains of Afghanistan. Alexander's dream of a political fusion of East and West, a single empire ruled by a new, blended Greco-Persian elite, would die with him. His empire would be torn apart by his own generals, the Diadochi, in decades of brutal civil war. But his cultural dream would not only survive, it would flourish. In the wake of his conquests, hundreds of thousands of Greek soldiers, merchants, artists, and administrators settled in the new cities he had founded across Asia and Egypt. They brought with them their language, their art, their philosophy, and their science. This fusion created the vibrant, dynamic, and incredibly innovative Hellenistic civilization. The great city of Alexandria in Egypt, with its legendary library and museum, became the intellectual capital of the world, a place where the knowledge of the Greeks, Egyptians, and Babylonians could be shared and expanded upon. It was in the Hellenistic world that geniuses like Euclid would codify geometry, Eratosthenes would calculate the circumference of the earth, and Archimedes would lay the foundations of modern engineering. It was a world of new philosophies like Stoicism and Epicureanism, new forms of art and literature, and a new globalized economy. This Hellenistic world, this legacy of Philip's realism and Alexander's romanticism, would serve as the crucial bridge between the classical Greek world and the rise of the next great superpower, Rome. The Romans would conquer the Hellenistic kingdoms politically, but they would be conquered culturally by the richness of Hellenistic civilization, absorbing its art, its science, and its philosophy, and ultimately preserving it and passing it on to the Western world. The story of the Macedonian Conquest, then, is the story of a violent and bloody birth. It is a story of how the brutal ambition and military genius of a father and a son in a span of just 3 decades demolished the old world order. The price was unimaginably high: the death of Greek freedom, the annihilation of one of the world's great empires, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. But from those ashes rose a new, more interconnected, and in many ways, more modern world. The dust that settled on the plain of Gaugamela covered the remains of an old world and fertilized the ground for a new one, a world that we, even today, are still the inheritors of. The age of the city-state was over. The age of empire had begun.